So Scott Minerd, one of the last remaining sane people within the mainstream of finance, he's of Guggenheim Partners, and he came out with a letter to their clients, I believe today, but definitely sometime in the last week, discussing what's going on right now with the Fed, and taking a pretty pessimistic outlook. Not necessarily pessimistic in terms of the price of financial assets. In fact, he was taking a very similar tone to people such as myself, who look at the Fed's actions as just a cynical attempt to prop up financial markets, and that to make sure that prices of assets such as stocks and bonds never go down, no matter what is happening in the real economy, completely detaching what little link there was between the price of financial assets and the underlying real economy. But Minerd, thankfully, and I'm pretty impressed with this, goes one step further. He looks a little bit beyond the curve at what all of this leads to. What's the end game that the Fed is bringing us closer to with all of their machinations and things? What effect does it have on American society, and I guess society in countries around the world, but America is where this is going to be the most severe, when the entire bottom rung of society, the vast majority of people who work in low-paying jobs and are already living paycheck to paycheck and have no savings, when they lose their income and are completely wiped out financially. But everyone at the top who owns all of these assets that should be crashing, because when you own the stock market, you are owning a share of the underlying U.S. economy. That's the idea, right? And even if you say that, well, American companies, like the S&P, most of the companies in there are multinationals, and so you're really buying a share of the global economy. Well, the global economy is in a depression too, so these people should be feeling some pain because they invested in companies that are not earning money right now. And yet, thanks to the Fed, investors have pretty much been made whole by this, relatively speaking. I mean, we're back to what the August lows. I mean, the overall decline from all-time highs in the stock market is barely a blip. We've lost a couple months of growth. And so if you're someone at the top of American society income-wise, the people who make all their money from financial assets through dividends and things like that, you're doing pretty okay still. Sure, you've taken a bit of a hit to your income, but you're certainly not starving. And the only reason for this is purely because of the Fed's interventions. And once this is what Minerd starts to get at, and it's something that other people have been have mentioned, and certainly I myself have talked about it, but it's not something that gets a whole lot of play, even amongst people who do say, hey, look, the Fed is creating a big financial bubble here, which they've done forever. Even before the Fed, we had inflated credit bubbles. That's just the nature of the financial system and how it was constituted. But it's so blatant right now, so blatantly, one-sided in favor of the rich that, Minerd looks at that and he says, gee, once ordinary people get a whiff of what's going on, that they see all these actions that the Fed are taking very publicly and how they're patting themselves on the back and how, the media is saying that that they're heroes and they're going to be put on the cover of magazines, just like with what happened with Bernanke. And everyone else is getting shafted and everyone else isn't even allowed to earn an income. These people who are sitting at home who own financial assets, they're still making money because it's not like you need to go work at a store to earn money, from your portfolio. That's a passive income. And so the rich absolutely have been bailed out, whereas ordinary people are waiting in bread lines at the food bank. Folks who not too long ago were earning an honest living, who had a sense of fulfillment in life because they were able to provide for their family, have been completely emasculated. They're not even permitted to earn an income, let alone, just unable to because of the state of the economy. And so when people look at this, at what's going on, isn't the logical thing then for people to say to their government, hey, the Fed has made the rich people whole. The Fed has bailed them out. Where do we get our bailout? If the Fed can just print money and give free money to rich people to make sure that the stock market doesn't go down, why can't they give that money to us? And it's a completely valid point, because morally speaking, I don't see why you wouldn't do that. I mean, if you're saying it's okay to print money and give it to rich people, that you know whether whether you do well in life should not necessarily determine what your income is. That even if you make bad choices in life and you end up losing in business, that you should still get paid. Well, once you've accepted that, well, then obviously you should extend that same privilege to poor people. I mean, you would think primarily poor people would get that benefit, not the rich. But of course, the only reason why this is possible and not totally catastrophic for the United States is because the Fed only does this for rich people, because the Fed only prints trillions and trillions of dollars and pumps it into the stock market. And the reason for that is that the people who are earning this money that the Fed is getting, the people who are taking advantage of all of this money production, are not going out and spending it at the grocery store. They're not going out and buying things at Walmart. They're not buying Chevrolet cars. Rich people do not spend a huge percentage of their income. So if you bail out their income this way, most of that money is going to go sit in other financial assets and not really make its way into the real economy. In other words, you never really feel the effects of the inflation from this money production. And as I've stated so many times, that's the key when it comes to inflating your currency and debasing your currency, whether you can get away with that or not. It's not that there's some magical American exceptionalism and the United States is completely immune from ever having a currency crisis and that we can just print as much money as we want. I mean, sure, a lot of people think that way, but that's utter hubris. There's no justification for that. And we will find that out if Minard is indeed correct, and there is a populist backlash that leads to something like a basic minimum income, which will have to be financed by the Fed, because the federal government is not taking in tax revenue. I mean, we were running trillion-dollar deficits to begin with. And so the only way that we will finance any sort of basic minimum income, the likes of which that Andrew Yang proposed, which, again, seems reasonable in this case, because you've got all these people who are told that they have to stay at home and they're not allowed to work. How are they going to pay their bills? How are they going to feed their family? People are destitute. Well, the only way that you're going to pay them to give them that money is by printing it. And, of course, if you print that money and give it to poor people, what are they going to do? They're going to go right out and spend it, and that's going to bid up the price of consumer goods. Because guess what? When you print dollars, you're not creating more wheat. You're not creating more beef. You're not creating more milk. All you're doing is creating more claims to those goods. And so once that is instituted, then that will be the beginning of the end of the U.S. dollar and of the United States. And if you think that this is still crazy and far-fetched, Nancy Pelosi was on MSNBC this morning talking about how it's time to start talking about a guaranteed income of some sort for individual people. And a crisis like this is the perfect opportunity. And that once this makes its way into the zeitgeist, which I think it already is, people like that idea right now, especially if they understood what was going on with QE for the rich folks. That QE for the rest of the people would become a no-brainer. And I think Trump is going to be the kind of politician who would want to be out in front of that. And so if this starts to catch on, Trump will certainly get behind it. It's not like Trump is some kind of free marketeer, far from it. He's supposed to be, the media told us he's this terrible, awful nationalist populist. Well, if that were the case, I think he'd be a little less keen on presiding over this massive handout to the rich that we've seen. Of course, on the one hand, this has been, the result of the Fed, so you can't exactly blame Trump for all of the Fed's actions, but Trump could have done a lot as far as speaking out against the Fed and what's been going on if he really was a true populist. But in order to reclaim a bit of that mantle, I think that the some kind of people's QE supported by Trump is a pretty reasonable thing to expect. And so getting back to why this would mean the end of America, or at least the end of the United States, the current regime, and again, that in and of itself is not such a crazy thing to think about. Lots of countries in the world, in fact, every country other than the U.S., has had, compared to us, pretty regular, regime changes. Portugal, France, other than Great Britain, but, lots of countries you've heard of, Spain, Italy, Russia, all the Eastern European countries, China, all of these countries have experienced regime change sometime in the last century, whereas we in America have had the same government since 1789. And it's remarkable that our system has lasted this long, especially considering how diverse the United States is. And again, I don't use diverse as some kind of euphemism for saying that black people live here. I mean that the United States, is home to a pretty heterogeneous society of people who have different values and different interests and different dialects and different religions and all these different things. And there's not a whole lot that unites these states, and there's not a whole lot that unites the individual states either. I don't exactly think that Florida is a viable nation state by any means. But with that said, what keeps the United States together is the myth of American prosperity. That, we are a nation of consumers, CONSOOMER. Consumption is the one thing that all Americans have in common, even if we do lead very different lives and, work in very different industries and in very different areas and in, very different climates. At the end of the day, every American, for the most part, eats McDonald's, shops at Walmart, and watches the NFL and, whatever other national sports leagues we have. But you take all this away. You take away the comforts that come with being an American. You take away all the benefits that, being an American used to mean. Well, then you're going to put a lot of strain on the political order and on our relationship as a society, because a collapse of the currency as a result of people's QE and massive inflation would mean a total collapse in the standard of living in the United States. Anyone who did have savings would be wiped out, and anyone who's on a fixed income would be wiped out because their income would now be worthless. And anybody who is not in one of those two categories would still feel the pain just the same, because there are so many other side effects of a rapidly depreciating currency. And so it's that point that the glue that holds American society together would completely deteriorate, and our government would be bankrupt and unable to provide its basic services that the people have come to expect. Things like Medicare and Social Security, would become meaningless. And so once we witness a total collapse of our federal government, either people will have to come together and agree to create something new to replace the dollar and to try and rebuild a new federal government, or people will fight over the details and go their separate ways eventually, trying to implement their own ideas. Which do you think is a little more likely in the case of the United States? Do you think that we're going to be like Germany in the 1920s and be able to throw away our old currency, the dollar, and create a new one? Do you think that Americans will be able to put their differences aside to try and, rebuild our economy and our society and try and work towards the common good? I highly doubt that. I think that a much more reasonable model, perhaps, is looking at what happened after the bankruptcy of the Soviet Union or Yugoslavia or one of those states, when they were forced to come together and decide what to do after the financial devastation of their countries. And in Yugoslavia, they chose to blame each other. And so they, and then that devolved into violence and things, and they started killing each other. I don't necessarily think that will happen in America. But in the Soviet Union, they also pretty much couldn't agree to come together and rebuild a new Soviet Union. And so what ended up happening is the constituent pieces of the Soviet Union crumbled apart, and everybody went their separate ways fairly peacefully. And if you look back, these sorts of events, like I was saying earlier, are not uncommon in world history. They're actually quite common. In ordinary nation states, governments come and go, every few decades sometimes. But the reason why those nations endure, even though they've been ruled by separate regimes, is because underlying they still have a national culture that that is more than just than just the state. In America, we don't have that. In America, the supposed American nation is a product of the state. It's a byproduct. And so without the state, without the federal government, I mean, the state with a lowercase s, not one of the 50 states, We are just an unhomogenized mass of people without any real common culture. I mean, what do people in California and Iowa have in common that people in Toronto and Seattle don't have in common? What I mean to say is that there's just as much of cultural differences between the U.S. and Canada as there is within the U.S. And yet none of us would ever look at the U.S. and Canada and think that, oh yeah, those are going to be the same country. I mean, sometimes people joke about Canada being the 51st state, but nobody thinks that Canada is going to be subsumed into the United States anytime soon. It's understood that Canadians are different, even if we do have certain things in common, like a language and certain media that we watch on TV. And so my point is that our politicians are really playing with fire here, and so is the Fed, because there would not be such a push for a people's QE, which will be the death of our country, if the Fed was not being so flagrant over the past at least 40 years, but I would argue longer, of just throwing out money and propping up financial markets. They've helped create a huge rot in our culture. And it's not something that's just going to get away. It's only festered and gotten worse. So on that note, I think I leave things here for today. If you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.